Container Catastrophe Updated by Mr. Hubub. This map is kind of odd, but I'll admit the intended line is pretty smooth if you can manage. But I'll start by saying that for weird and unique transitions, you need a lot of visibility, as well as something to tell the player what to do. Dots, lines, and arrows are all valid options that creators implement into their own tracks. There's a container in the way of the transition as well. It totally blocks the player from seeing you're supposed to keep spiraling up the right side. I would have definitely moved it up some more so the track is more visible, but if you're going to implement containers in the gameplay, why not have you drive through them? I think this level could have been more interesting if it was longer and involved a container gimmick within it. And while a container map isn't the most unique idea, it is executed well enough. Although the track does not feel like it fits in the map in the slightest. I don't know whether this was a personal challenge to not paint anything, because it's not a ZSL track from what I can see, but painting would have helped here. Especially when there's just random grass patches floating in this harbor. So painting is one thing, but track supports are another. If you're going for a realistic environment, like this seems to be, the easiest thing to do is just extend the piece of supports down to the ground level. It's barely any effort, and it blends the track with the environment so it isn't floating randomly above it. I don't have much to say about the gameplay other than adding path indicators, especially for that first bit, but I do have to mention that the beginning is frustratingly slow to start. 6 seconds of no input going straight into an extremely learny transition, it adds up significantly for a part that doesn't need to exist. Being AFK isn't exactly adding any fun to your tracks, so best to keep the breaks of no input to a minimum. Overall, this track could definitely be improved in a multitude of ways, and could have been longer to make it more interesting. But I appreciate the sentiment of a weird transition being most, if not all, of the track, because weird transitions in longer tracks can be even more frustrating, especially if they're near the end. But that's all I have for this one. Let's move on. Autumn Temple by Round and ZT. This review was written by justMaki. Looks-wise, these aesthetics are really pretty, and done with a reasonable amount of blocks, sitting at 1200. The track is super smooth, maybe on the harder side because of the use of grass in most sections, but it really isn't that bad. If this track was all grass, I think most would find it a lot less enjoyable, so you have to agree that the sporadic patches are at least better than that. There's only a small amount of areas that would require some learning if the player is not familiar with grass, but it's not like this is meant for beginners anyways. Now the good. The flow is immaculate. Round really takes it to another level when it comes to the smoothness of off-grid and rotated pieces. If you're not familiar with the track editor, you might even believe some of these transitions are part of the base game track pieces. It's that well done. Trust me and trust everyone that's tried it. Off-grid tracks are hard to get smooth. But you know you've done it right when the turns feel this satisfying to get right. The decoration is kept nice and simple, but it fills the space very effectively. Especially the ominous squares out in the fog. Touches like that just add so much to the world you want your level to be in. It's context for the track even being here, that there's other things out there than just where you're driving. And although I love to see shadows cast on the road, I'm a sucker for sunsets. Sometimes they can make it harder to ascertain the shape, and I think this section here does feel like there's too much going on. But they can do the opposite as well. It all depends on the context. This sausage downhill is made very clear by the shadows. It breaks up the flat color enough to let the player really understand the shape of this piece. So this barely matters, and it's kind of a hit or miss which side you'll be on with your level. But if a road shape is unclear, adding shadows cast along it can definitely help. Now back to some talk about grass. It is definitely difficult to learn the flow the author intends on this map. The way low friction surfaces kinda throw you out of sausage and banked turns is hard to get used to, and requires the player to think about their setup as to not drift too much or even fly off the track in some sections. It's not as bad as other surfaces like ice or even soap, but it takes some thinking to understand it fully. And while the color palette is very nice, the signage could stand out a bit more. Because green is a contrasting color for the trees, I think blue would be a great complementary color to make the arrows pop more. When you're driving, it's hard to try and pay attention to anything other than the road itself, so if the signs don't catch the player's eye, they won't work. But along with color choice, there could be some improvements on sign placement. Most of them are placed in the perfect areas, but this one here for the U-turn just does not explain what you need to do here, if the player sees it at all. Very simple fix, add a road border here, and just move the arrow ahead of the player where they will face towards it and be able to see where they need to go down and to the right. Arrow placement somewhat matters, but if you're including them, just make sure they're doing their job well. Overall, this is a very pretty track with a lot of unexpected technicality to it. Off-grid gameplay like this can be a pain to pull off, but Round knows what they're doing, and it's always great to see what new combination of pieces they come up with. Very fun for the pro players in lobbies, but not for the faint of heart. Okay, let's move on. ZSL Mountain Bike Trail 3 by ReedFreak7. Already, I have something to point out here. This start is so slow. Like I said in a previous review, slow starts like this add up over time. This map specifically has 6 seconds with no input. Now, I do have to admit, it does align with the mountain bike theme, but for a Zeepkist map I always dislike starts that take too long to get going. The decoration is nice and simple, but I love the assortment of grass and leaf paints. It feels like a forest in autumn. It's super dense and still relatively light on pieces. The little clearings where you can see the sky are so nice. So this first dropdown is blind, but not as blind as other maps. Yes, like all other maps with blind transitions, it takes some learning to know where you need to go, but here there are at least trees to help give the player something to align with. So this specific one barely matters. It fits with the theme, and I think is an excuse enough. But this loop is a little worse in my opinion. I definitely don't like how each side is overlapping with each other, meaning you can crash into the loop as you're exiting. The Zeepkist camera, at the moment, does not do a good job with super tight loops, and you just have to crash to know to stay on the right side when exiting here. And the dropdown right after the loop is kinda frustrating for me. The edge of the half pipe is in low contrast because of the similar color grass around it, and I'm constantly misjudging where I am and clip my wheels trying to land this smoothly. But the rest of the map is really smooth and enjoyable. This spiral is wonderfully made. The use of the sausage pieces is great to ensure the player stays on track throughout it. And this big jump is also tuned to near perfection. If you're slower, just a little arms up. If you're faster, just a tiny brake tap. Overall, it's a really technical track with some definite learning spots, but this is absolutely the best representation of a mountain bike trail I've seen in the game, along with the other tracks ReedFreak has made in the series. Alrighty, let's see what's up next. ZSL Glimmering Grove by CDAW, Rehomes92, and justMaki. So this level is for the no paint Zeepkist Super League theme. Where other creators went really deep using weird pieces to get the paints they want without the paint tool, this collaboration opts for a more classic approach, a very adventure-like track visually. Now, to me, the gameplay seems to be trying a bit too hard to be unique. It gets a little weird in some sections. I can't really point out any specific areas, because it's more the quantity of the weirdness that adds up. Most of the transitions in the map feel like that one transition from any other level. You know what I mean, that part that sticks out as a sudden difficulty spike, or the place to gain all your speed from. For a ZSL track, this makes this on the harder side, as you have to experiment and learn almost every turn in the map. And while it's not a super long map, it definitely isn't on the shorter side. This one gets learny. I don't have much to say about the decoration, I think it's fine. There are these rock carvings that are pretty neat, but if we're talking about world building, it would have been cool to see some ruins or anything else tied to these carvings. And visibility is pretty good for almost the whole track. The use of signs is done wonderfully, and their placements are pretty much as good as they can be, so good job there. But there is one transition I have a problem with. For context, the same entrance to this upside down tube is done previously in the track, and as you go down, you can see you need to move over for the exit. But on this other one near the end, that reaction time is cut down to absolute 0. You cannot see where you need to be for the exit, and the fact that it is all covered in shadow doesn't do this transition any good. It is terribly difficult to react to this. Either you get lucky, or you just have to crash here to know what's up. I've played the track a fair amount, and yet this still gets me, even though I know it's there. The turn is just way too quick for the speed you have. The one previously in the level was so much better. I do enjoy most of the rest of the track, because it's pretty fun after you get used to everything. Overall, this is a difficult to learn, but pretty fun track. I don't have much else to say, so we'll move on. The Fridge, Reworked by TheBestMaidens. What a cool idea for a track, racing through a giant fridge full of assorted foods. But was it executed well? Before we get into it, this is a long track, so we'll be here for a bit. To start off, hidden boosters, bad. I will die alone on this hill. You don't hide level mechanics from your players. Anyways, this is a very learning map, and considering the length, this is quite hard to complete going in blind. My experience with this track was fail at a part, restart run, get past that part, fail in the next part, repeat. Not a very fun time if I'm honest. And for few of the jumps in this track, you just kinda have to throw yourself at them to see what works. There's not nearly enough guides or markers showing you any setups, you're very much on your own to learn this one. The transition tubes down to each layer especially. Them being glass makes it even harder to know what side you're supposed to be on when going down, especially because all of them, except the very last one, you're supposed to drive down the backside. That's just a dirty move in my opinion to change it up at the very end. So, gameplay issues. There's some definite overjumping on landings here, and they are quite unsatisfying. I don't want to be throwing around the word jank lightly, but I can see players calling parts of this map jank for sure. This specific fridge layer contains the worst offenders for me. This jump, the best way I found to take it was to skip the initial landing and land on the banked curve instead. Every time I tried to turn down into the slope here, it just didn't work out for me. There's not enough room for the player to comfortably get that angle right and land cleanly. And the next one right after is also pretty blind. This may be because of the checkpoint force field getting in the way, but you're coming up from below and seeing the bottom of where you're landing through the glass. That combination just makes this weird to see what's going on. There is a hand pointing you kind of in the right direction, but it doesn't do much other than tell you to go straight, which the booster on the ramp does better anyways. It's also just way out of the way of where you would be looking, and not consistent with the visuals of the other arrows in the map. My go-to for something like this? Make a support bar to hang the sign on above the landing. Then where you're supposed to land is clearly between the bottom of the road and the sign. And right after, the tube leads you into a transition that is not aligned with where you're jumping. It took me a bit to realize this, and I kept landing way too far right and not making it into the tube. If you're making a jump that isn't going to be marked, it should at the very least be aligned with the takeoff, like the one at the start does. And right after, there's some cubes of sugar or salt, I don't know which, that are supposed to guide you around the pancake. From a top-down perspective, you can see how they're lined up, but from a driving perspective, they are indistinguishable from being random piles. If you're using arrows elsewhere, I don't know why there aren't arrows here as well. Consistent guides are important. It greatly matters. But thankfully, the other layers of the fridge are perfectly fine for me. The watermelon section gives a player ample time to see where they should jump. I never had any problems here. And the last layer is just some basic wall rides, although coming into this section is scary. This is just personal preference, but long spiral wall rides I just find boring. It's essentially just AFK time. Okay, that was long. I don't have many words about the decoration, other than the scale of the foods is inconsistent, but this level is only 500 pieces, so optimization is definitely not a problem here. Overall, it's a really cool idea that I think was slightly let down by the very learny gameplay. Lobbies nowadays are usually between 5 and 7 minutes, so track length is important if you want people to learn and play your maps in that short a time span. Okay, let's see what we have next. CSL Patent by Jakie. This review was written by Lexer. First of all, great track title. This is also for the no paint theme for the Zeepkist Super League, and it looks great. Most players probably won't even realize that it was under that restriction. Now, a 30-second track is a little low for ZSL, but I think most people won't mind having a shorter track to play in the tournament setting. Although you can definitely get times under 30 seconds, the rule states it is only the author time that counts, as not everyone can predict how fast some people will go. The track is pretty flowy, and the small grass patches just add a little bit more engagement, even letting the player cut some inside corners if they're feeling up to it. I think if this was double the length, around a minute long, it would definitely be a harder ZSL map. But the short length decreases the skill gap substantially, so most people should finish it just fine. If you're going to layer road pieces to make designs like these, the best way to do it is with the Object Properties mod, and make your top layer 0.001 above the initial road layer. Any subsequent layers, you just increase by that amount each time. This will ensure the road is as smooth as it can be, because without this method, eyeballing it can get you some lips in the road that might conjure the wrath of some Unity weirdness. This doesn't even matter in this context, because I don't think anybody has had any problems with these specific designs in the level, so no meter here. Another layering issue comes up with this split road here. The arrow tells you to go right, but a Zeepkist player's intuition would likely draw them to go left because of which road border is on top here. It barely matters, and there is an arrow guiding you anyways, but it is something to think about as a mapper. The path the player takes in this context should be the top one for readability. This being a short map, obviously there will be the most important part for good times, and it happens to be this pretty difficult jump to the quarter pipe. You might not see this as difficult immediately, but from a racer's perspective, this is brutal. That leaderboard time you're looking for is getting the cleanest landing you can on this jump, and with it being so far to the right, you really have to be on the edge of the takeoff and as straight as possible to land cleanly. And while it doesn't really matter, I just want to make a note that the speed you carry into the jump is quite dictated by how much you get from these two boosters. And the line to maximize that is pretty unintuitive to figure out for slower players, and it even sets you up poorly for the already precise jump mentioned before. But overall, it's a well done track for having not used the paint tool, and there's some cool techniques used here to get around that restriction. With it being a short track and only a few notes on the gameplay, this track is still enjoyable to play. And that was the last review. Thank you for watching this episode of ZMR, I hope you enjoyed. Remember to join the Discord in the description below to submit your maps for review in an upcoming episode. I've been Linzi, and I'll see ya.